The album was a huge commercial success. It went to number one on the US Billboard 200 in its second week on the American chart. It also went to number one in the UK, Canada, and New Zealand. Okay, so let's get into the background of a little bit.
Also, Royce, when it was released, just like Physical Graffiti, when it was released, every single Led Zeppelin album went back on the top 100
No, that's
Billboard
right.
list.
Yeah,
Only the
that's
Beatles, Pink
right.
Floyd, and Zeppelin
That
could
happened.
do that,
Michael,
back in the days. The Stones, maybe,
That happened twice. The earlier time was
Yeah.
right before Physical Graffiti. Every single one of their albums was on charting. And the second time was right here. Eighth studio album came out, and they were all on the chart. Just like insane.
And let's make it clear, because if there's an album with potholes, this is the one. We'll be discussing that tonight, but it's sold so well. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. We talked about this. Please go to last week's stream if you haven't seen it, because matter of fact, go back. If you've missed anything on Led Zeppelin, you're missing part of the story, because we've been weaving this all on purpose. Now, that live album, The Song Remains the Same, sold so well and was the closest thing to a Led Zeppelin greatest hits. It also had a very heavily fan supported film out in major things. So people had reawakened to the fact that Zeppelin was still around. And I think a lot of the initial sales for this album, because if you look at its sales in total compared to others, it's not quite the success story it was at launch. And that's because I don't think this album is the strong. Matter of fact, I'll say it tonight for the first time. I've always given this, out of their 9 albums, the number 8 position. I've slipped it to 9. Coda is a much better Led Zeppelin album. And we'll be talking about that one coming up too. So
yeah, Michael, this is far from my favorite album as well.
This is my least favorite studio album.
I'd like to, on Michael's thought about the release of Song Remains the Same, it helped invigor people that weren't able to get to a concert. They put the band in front of more people's eyes.
Yeah, good point.
That's what helped bring this album up. I really enjoyed this album, but we'll get to that in a minute.
First of all, any criticism I have of this album tonight, I just want to put this disclaimer based on what Nick just said. It's a Led Zeppelin didn't make bad albums. Okay, it's a great album. I consider all 9, and my original assessment of Led Zeppelin when my channel first started was they had 7 masterpieces and 2 good albums. And I've renegotiated that, because after 2 years of listening to more Zeppelin than I ever did in my life, I'm telling you, they're all masterpieces.
No,
but
I know.
In my opinion, tonight's masterpiece is the lesser one. But
we still
regardless,
have our ranking. We definitely still have our ranking.
Yeah.
Okay,
so
the album was named by the group to describe its struggles after the death of Robert Plant's son Karak in 1977, and the taxation exile. They were tax exiles from their home, UK. The exile resulted in the band not being able to tour in the UK for more than 2 years, and therefore trying to get back was like trying to get in through the outdoor. Okay. All right. So that's kind of where the title was all coming from. The group began rehearsing material in September 1978. After 6 weeks, they traveled to Polar Studios in Stockholm to begin recording. In contrast to previous Led Zeppelin albums, Into the Outdoor features much greater influence on the part of bassist and keyboardist John Paul Jones and vocalist Robert Plant, and relatively less from drummer John Bonham and guitarist Jimmy Page. Bonham was, pardon me?
May I make a comment about that before you continue?
Yes.
What you're saying, the Jones and Plant had more input. It was basically
Yes.
Page and Bonham were not exactly early risers at the time, and whoever got to the studio first got to pretty much take control of that day's recording.
Well, that's
Right.
100% correct. But
Not only were they not early risers, they were absolutely at their worst low point in their lives. They, Bonzo with they were both doing drugs and alcohol, but with Bonzo, it was alcohol.
Yeah, Bonzo was struggling with alcoholism,
and Jimmy with
Page
harder
was
stuff.
battling heroin addiction.
Right, right.
Jones later said, many of the songs were consequently put together by Plant and Jones during the day, with Page and Bonham adding their parts late at night. Jones was inspired by his Yamaha GX1 synthesizer he had just purchased, and he was working closely with Robert, something which hadn't happened in the past. So that's kind of interesting. So you can see why, all of their albums kind of have a different twist to them. After the recording sessions at Polar, the album was mixed at Page's personal studio at his home in Plumpton. Now these songs, Wearing and Tearing, Ozone Baby, and Darlene, the last being a boogie woogie based song, credited to all band members, that last song, were recorded during sessions for this album, but were dropped because of space constraints.
Yeah, they should have dropped a couple of cuts they used and put those on. As far as I'm concerned,
later released on Coda. Now, what I want to talk about is before we get into some more meat and potatoes, and this is kind of meat and potatoes too, as far as I'm concerned, the album sleeve packaging and artwork. Okay,
brilliant.
The album artwork was designed by Hypnosis, which had been typical for some time. The Hypnosis is Storm Thorgerson. Okay, in 1980, Hypnosis was nominated for a Grammy Award in the category of Best Album Package for Into the Outdoor. The original album featured an unusual gimmick. The outer sleeve was made to look like a plain brown paper bag, manager Peter Grant's idea, reminiscent of similarly packaged bootleg albums and sleeves, and white line art and the white line artwork. Yeah, there you go. I've got mine sitting right here behind me. It's kind of hard.
I figured I'd show it while you talk about it.
Yeah, go for it, man. Okay, so the inner sleeve featured black and white light line artwork, which when wiped with a wet rag or sponge would activate an invisible ink and become permanently colored. Now that's just the original. That's not like all our remasters here, okay? There were also 6 different album sleeve variants. Now hold on, folks. I'm going to put that up. We have 6 different...
And by the way, I've got a video I just put out maybe 2 weeks ago, so I encourage everybody to go see it, all dedicated to this album, and I put up all the artwork on that video. So if you're ever wondering, what are the other covers like? I always wanted the cover with the guy up close.
Yeah. Okay, well, I've got the picture now up of the 6 covers.
The other album that they did a lot of trickery with photographs was rephotographing the brother and sister that posed for Houses of the Holy, right? Yeah. And so a lot of care was taken in aspects of people in that picture. This one ups that like 30 times as far as concept, and then to wrap it in a brown paper bag.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Something so magnificent, and then delivered in a brown. You kind of felt like, Led Zeppelin was offering you their own bootleg. I was going to say about this song, "Hot Dog," Royce. This is one of those, I said a few times on this album, Jimmy really just with his chicken scratching. Yeah. Okay, he learned that from, we've talked about how Jimmy and Robert, or John Paul Jones, were half of Britain's version of the Wrecking Crew. There were 4 people that were on more records than the Beatles. Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones. And I always forget the other 2 gentlemen. I'm not English. But the other one was a guitarist who handled most of the country tracks, and Jimmy learned a lot from him. And this song is a perfect example of that man's influence, whoever he was. I'm sorry,
Well, I know.
I should have looked him up before.
Glenn Campbell was part of the Wrecking Crew at one time.
Yeah,
Unless it
yeah,
has a
but
different
this
name
is
here,
that chicken scratch stuff from Appalachia.
Okay.
And
I love that.
here's
Bluegrass.
why it works. It sounds
Yeah.
like there's tons of mistakes. It's you know, and then you listen to it and you go, man, no, man, he's right on beat. But it gives that gobble effect to the whole song. You know, that kind of feel to it, a real jaunty feel, and it takes you on. So this is one of my favorite tracks, and a perfect side ender. You always want a good opener and an ender for both sides of your LP, or all sides of your LP if you've got more than one.
Totally.
So
Does anybody
it's
know what that-
interesting because these two tracks I see as the beginning of Robert Plant's solo career. And when you see it in that way, both tracks sit a little easier with me. All My Love is just such a fabulous song. But to me, it's like is a big ballad like Ship of Fools. You know, not that they have anything to do with each other as far as what they are about, but this grand ballad by Roberts. You know, the new Richard Burton of rock. You know, and so maybe that's why some of these I'm going, and I'm a fan of his early solo career. I love it, but I don't see it and go, that's Led Zeppelin. I see that's Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin. And
right. Okay.
So that's
which song
my only
are
thing.
you describing?
Well, I'm saying both of these songs. Both of these songs could have easily fit. The one that's coming up, we're going to be talking about, and this one Robert Plant's solo career. Even though this track has a lot of JPJ. JPJ was just informing Robert where he was going to go in a lot of ways on this album too.
Okay, so let's get into All My Love now. It's an unconventional love song composed by Plant and Jones when they were first to arrive in the studio. As we talked about earlier, they'd get there early. Bonham and Page would come in at night and lay their parts down, let their tracks down. Okay, they were the first to arrive at the studio, so they came in early. They composed this song. I really like this track. It's my favorite track on side 2, absolutely. Okay, now this goes back to what Nick was saying. It was written in honor of Plant's son, Karak, who died while Led Zeppelin was on their 1977 North American tour. How heartbreaking is that? You're not even at home when it happens. Jones played a classical-inspired synthesizer solo in the middle of the track. And again, this is my favorite song on this side. So, okay, guys, so it really kind of ties in nicely with what you were saying, Nick.
Yeah, it's this is more of the pain and the love.
Yeah,
exactly. John Paul really shining on this one, and Bonzo taking the lead, and then Plant, the three of them together. But first John Paul leading in, Bonzo picking it up, becoming more powerful. You know, the love, the power of love being shown through Plant's voice and vocals. Yeah, and it's about family at this point.
Family, correct?
Yes, and that's how I see All of My Love. You know, it's all I have. All my being is all my love.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's
great.
I
pretty much ditto what Nick says regarding this track. It's a wonderful track. My favorite on the album. Yeah. It's and it was a, this is what you call one of those songs that just come to you. They wrote it quick. It comes. Yeah. It just came from the ethos.
From the heart. It came from the heart.
But I'm talking about its hookability. It was a very popular song. It's got a hook and a half to it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, as
very
Jersey
good.
Double earlier in the comments said, it was perfect for the radio at the time.
Absolutely, I concur with that easily. Yes.
And that's a completely different view of the song versus listening to the album.
Yes.
Because there's no connection of the pain before this shows up. So it
And
has its commercial ability right there because they're not connected as a
it
single.
was, yeah, and it was a chance for fans to. Sorry, I keep getting up for newbies. I have a back, but it was a chance for fans to mourn with the band. That's how you felt. You felt their pain. It would happen later when Eric Clapton wrote "Tears in Heaven."
Yeah.
Remember how that happened?
Yeah.
And this is when art touches the heart of and can make money for an artist, but screw the money. It's not about the money. This was a real tragedy. No, every single fan and casual fan,
Nightmare.
nobody should lose a child.
Nobody.
Ever.
These
you know?
last two songs have really
Right.
brought me thinking of Clapton and Plant together. You know,
I always identify both these
Yeah.
two.
Yeah.
Every time.
I couldn't
Yeah.
help listening to it. I couldn't help thinking of him as well.
Right.
Tears in
Yeah.
Heaven, one and another one that had a great hook.
It was the band's final studio album released to reach the top of the charts in the United States. Okay, so In Through the Outdoor is the Led Zeppelin album that has spent the most weeks on the top of the charts, tied with Led Zeppelin 2. Led Zeppelin 2. To date, the album has sold 6 million copies in the U.S.
As I said, it put eyes on the band and heard their music and got to see them. That's why.
And I just somewhat kind of tie a little bit of this in together. Is
Absolutely.
like you guys are bringing up the change of genre, how it's more keyboard and synthesizer set, and like you mentioned, Michael, how you listen to it, like when you come into listening to it. I think if you look at some of the fans in the '80s and the synthesizer heavy kind of rock that was coming out there,
Yeah.
if your first intro to Led Zeppelin was something of that style, aka In Through the Outdoor, then the older Led Zeppelin is a completely different genre than you entered it. So it'll definitely pick up new fans, but it wouldn't overly necessarily mean that the rest of their catalog will come along with it because it's such a different genre than what they started with.
Except that
Yeah.
the rest of the catalog did come along with it in sales.
Let me finish my point. I think we might be talking the same thing, perhaps. When it re-brought the rest of their catalog up, was that who was buying it at the time? Was it the people that were just learning it from the '80s and all the stuff that came out in the '80s, or was it the older people that were listening to it and saying, "Hey, I know this," and then backtracking through their collection? They got a lot of new fans out of it, or did they just?
Yeah.
Well, back in those days, the majority of your record buyers were still teenagers. And back in those days, people, when they got into their 20s, the average music fan bought less and less. So, no, I don't think it was, I think it was new fans. And I was going to say this, Chris, there are two bands in the history of rock and roll, maybe three if you consider the Stones, that continually replenish brand new fans every 4 or 5 years. Every 4 or 5 years, a whole new slew of 15, 16-year-old males find these bands, males primarily, and put them on a pedestal. And they do this by, absorbing the entire catalog. And so we know that at least 8/9 of their catalog has a sound, and this is slightly ajar. So I think it did introduce people, and it made Zeppelin even bigger because of that. And I acknowledge that when Nick and I were talking about it.
Maybe I misspoke, or maybe I agree.
Yeah,
with
maybe
you.
I misheard you, brother.
It definitely brought in new audience.
I'm sorry. I think there's another edge to that sword that we're missing.
Yeah.
I think that when this album came out, it did gain new ears and new people because it was a different sound. But also you take into account that the movie that was out prior to it, people that hadn't really seen or heard the band, especially seen them, have now seen them. And now it's taking time for these kids money's tight. So now they're going back through the catalog and buying an album at a time as money allows. And they're starting to go back and buy the albums that had already come out and been hits that they hadn't been introduced to before. So we got the new album sales with a new album, and you got the residual from the movie going backwards buying albums. So that, to me, is what accounts for all of these albums being on the charts at the same time.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Everybody's got such interesting ideas on this album tonight on the panel.
I know.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, so I think we're going to continue here a little bit, and critical reception into the outdoor divided contemporary critics and Led Zeppelin fans. Some found its synthesizer-influenced music inevitable but forward-thinking, while others felt the band had forsaken their heavy, fast sound. According to Jimmy Page's biographer, Martin Powell, predictably, in the wake of punk, as Michael was saying earlier, Into the Outdoor received a rough ride from some critics, with Zepp's veteran status in the music business now used as a stick with which to beat them.
Yeah, but when they first hit the scene, didn't they say the same thing?
Yep.
Yes.
It's brand new stuff that's going to be terrible until, of course, it sold millions.
Yeah.
So they're getting hit with the same stick.
Right. So, okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you can't talk about Zeppelin or any album of Zeppelin without talking about the critics who hated Zeppelin.
Right.
Britain hated Zeppelin. Zeppelin was so freaking, almost slipped there, organic, that it reached the kids. It reaches anybody who's willing to embrace a heavy, occasional rock sound, and a band who will go in other directions. It embraces that audience and it draws them in. And the critics did their best, right along with Jan Winter and Rolling Stone as the major magazine. Zeppelin couldn't get a good review from their album, from their magazine, until Led Zeppelin 4. Oh, gee, didn't that happen to Paul McCartney and Band on the Run? Exactly. Exactly. See what I mean?
Aptitude.
Oh, my God. Sometimes the music industry just enrages me.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so reviewing the album in Rolling Stone, Michael, Charles Young said Page's diminishing creativity resulted in a little good material to work with for Plant, whose lyrics Young found inane, and Bonham, whose drumming was viewed as heavy-handed. This brought to the forefront the keyboard playing of Jones. Chris Bond from Melody Maker said the impressionable first play of the record had everyone in the office rolling around laughing. It's Led Zeppelin, while accusing the band of being totally out of touch and displaying the first intimations of mortality. Robert Christo also wrote positively, of the record in Village Voice, observing the usual lacks in the lyrics department, but regarding the album as the group's best since Houses of the Holy in '73.
Well, and here's another thing. Twice you've mentioned in those readings there, Royce, that of a critic criticizing the lyrics by Robert Plant. Inane. Go back to any review of any Led Zeppelin album, and you'll see the word. It was a word they all chose to use in their thing. Let's use this word. Inane writing of Robert Plant. Screw them all.
Well,
before we conclude tonight, I think it's important to remember concerning this album that, and I have an upcoming video I've been promising to do. Where I want to compare this album and Presence. Because
I think that would be a good comparison.
They are the heads and tails of each other.
Yeah.
On Presence, we have a very powerful and interactive and creative Bonzo and Jimmy. and a reluctant, but affable go along from JPJ, and a guy who just fucking didn't want to be there. Sorry, Royce. And then you've got this album, and everything's flipped again.
Right.
So think about this: if they had released these two albums as a double album, whoa! Now we'd be talking about this double album, because in a way they kind of are. Yeah, I always think of Rubber Soul and Revolver as a double album, the double R album, Revolving Soul, or Rubber Revolver, whatever,
Whatever,
and even George Harrison backs me up on that. He said that, well, actually, those albums could be considered parts A and parts B.
Big problem,
and he loved them. He loved them, But I'm saying some albums kind of go together in that way, organically, and these two just complement each other wonderfully, I think.
Yeah. Well, there's probably
one reason. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Roy.
No. You go ahead. Because
there's one reason you can't have it as a double album. It's called.
Well, of course.
I mean,
of course.
And they are distinctly different, but yet they're bookends. Yeah, right. I see that. But it comes down to money.
They kind of bookend one Robert Plant's two tragedies, right? The first one was the accident, and then it compounded by his son.
Absolutely.
And together they represent a band. When fractured, and I love 4-member bands. All right, like Paul said, the Beatles were a box, and every Beatle had their quadrant in that box, right? And so I like bands that are 4-member bands. I have a soft, a soft spot for those kind of bands. And here you've got two members not being able to do on presence, and the other two at a creative height. And then it flips on the next album, and the two that were so creative can barely show up, and the guys that couldn't have been bothered practically on the first album, come to the fore. That's a band, folks. Yeah. That's why we grew up with those kind of bands, not the little shit holes that are out there today.